Okay, so as students of music, as historians, as people trying to understand the world we live in, how we got here, where we're going, it's our job to try to figure out why music changed in the way that it did. Remember that art is an expression of the times in which it was created, but sometimes the art itself is the change agent. It both responds to the times but also influences it. We've already identified some clues as to why music shifted from what we know of the Romantic period into the many fractured styles and sounds of the 20th century. We've touched on changing technology, which is a huge factor, and we've talked about some of the characters representing the end of the 1800s, over-beautified ancient Vienna, and then more modern Berlin. These different places have an influence on the composers who live there, and then the music they create influences the times that they lived in. We've touched a bit on the kind of thinking that was going on, the philosophical undertones of the times, and those philosophies are linked always to the political and social environment of the times. We're going to go deeper into that philosophical realm today. Remember that Mahler and Strauss discussed what the role of art was in their society? They were very conscious of that question in a way that earlier composers may not have been. Composers in Haydn's day and even back in Bach's day, they didn't have the conception of artist that we have today. Artists were sort of considered craftspeople, like cabinet makers. They were servants to the church back in the Baroque period and before. And then starting in the Baroque period up through the Classical period, musicians, composers were often working largely for rich benefactors, for dukes, for princes, people who wanted music composed for events at their lavish estates and palaces. But starting around Beethoven's time and then intensifying, composers started thinking of themselves as artists, capital A, and as such they grew increasingly self-aware of the role they were playing in their society, and therefore they started taking on the role of change agents, conscious change agents within their society. The questions: what do we want society to be? Do we really have the power to change it? These are heavy questions. Remember that music didn't exist in an artistic bubble either. It was connected to other arts: painting, sculpture, writing, poetry, philosophy, dance. Let's take a look at the author Thomas Mann. He was a German author and he was a music lover. We talked about him a few episodes ago. He was at the premiere of Salome in Graz in 1906, and he even used that scene in his writing. Listen to this description of the role of art from his 1902 story, Gladius Dei. So he defines for us what artists viewed art's role as, or at least his view of what art's role was in the early 1900s. There's a character named Hieronymus, and he is appalled by the kitschy art in the shops of Munich. By kitsch, Thomas Mann means art that is just pretty, but doesn't have any underlying meaning. He says, quote, "Do you think gaudy colors can gloss over the misery of the world?" Hieronymus shouts. "Do you think loud orgies of luxurious good taste can drown the moans of the tortured earth? Art is the sacred torch that must shed its merciful light into all life's terrible depths, into every shameful and sorrowful abyss. Art is the divine flame that must set fire to the world, until the world with all its infamy and anguish burns and melts away in redeeming compassion." There was a fascination in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, of secret societies, and this is going to come up more in the next episode, but things like Rosicrucian societies, Kabbalistic, neo-pagan, all these different secret societies sort of offered kind of like a rupture from the world of the present in which people were living. That's going to become more significant, but I just want to throw it out there. In the political sphere, communists and anarchists and ultranationalists were plotting from various angles to overthrow quasi-liberal monarchies of Europe. Leon Trotsky was in exile in Vienna from 1907 to 1914, and he began publishing a regular communist newspaper, later the official newspaper of the Communist Party in Russia. Psychology was a new field, and Sigmund Freud was on the scene. The world felt unstable, and there was a sense of imminent catastrophe. And there was an imminent catastrophe. World War I is coming down the pike, and it is coming in large part because of a lot of the stuff that is happening, and artistically, a lot of that artistic mojo is responding to those factors. Vienna is a perfect symbol of the pitched battle between the bourgeoisie and the avant-garde. The avant-garde being the new thinkers, the change makers. There was a man named Karl Schorsky who called them the truth seekers. They were also labeled critical modernists by the philosopher Alan Janik. The group of critical thinkers grew increasingly angry at the rampant aestheticism of Vienna. What do I mean by that? Vienna had a habit of covering all available surfaces in gold leaf. These These critical thinkers saw what was supposed to be a modern, liberal, tolerant society, but instead they were saying that that society was failing to deliver on their promises. So here's a problem, let's just cover it with beautiful art. In truth, large parts of the Viennese society in the early 1900s were confined to poverty and misery. So these truth seekers were speaking out on behalf of outcasts, the homosexuals, the prostitutes, the Jews. Many of these critical modernists were Jewish, and they were increasingly aware that it was still almost impossible to assimilate fully into a society that was rampantly anti-Semitic, regardless of their devotion to German society. Many of the Jews had said, yes, we are going to be Germans, and yet they were still discriminated against. Mahler is a perfect example of a Jewish composer working toward the idea of Austro-Germanic ideals, but in the end, he felt a lot of discrimination despite his professional successes. In America, too, remember his first engagement when he came overseas was shut down because of the problem of the Jew. According to the rhetoric of the truth seekers in Vienna, the cult of beauty was a lie. Art's job then was to become critical, to become negative. It had to differentiate itself from the bourgeois culture. So the work of Strauss and of Mahler belonged to that bourgeois culture. They were kind of the avant-garde of the bourgeoisie, but they still represented that beautiful old world. The truth seekers, they needed to go further afield, separate themselves more. We can often think of each period in history being either kind of the embracing of or a reaction against whatever came before it. Art in this period, at least from this segment of society, became increasingly reactionary. Art Nouveau was a compulsion to cover everyday objects in ornament. Here's a reaction against that. The architect Adolf Loos attacked that movement. Why cover everyday objects in what he called wasteful ornament? In 1911, he shocked the city and the emperor by building an unadorned semi-industrial facade in one of the major squares of Vienna. New themes were being captured in art and literature. Oskar Kokoschka and Egon Schiele, they were painting pictures that were bordering on softcore pornography. The theme, the insatiability of lust and the violence of sex. These are new themes popping up in fine art. George Trakl was writing poetry documenting the onset of insanity and suicidal despair. These artists were starting to use their art to ask questions about the very nature of their society. And these are difficult questions. And by nature, it's difficult art. So for the first time, we have a society actively using art and philosophy to try to diagnose and repair some of its ills. There's a lot of examination of the ethics of the time. There was an idea that Europe suffered from racial, sexual, and ethical degeneration. Okay, that seems like something that should be examined, right? But when we look at it in retrospect from today's perspective, we have to take some of it with a grain of salt, because these philosophers were critical of their society, but remember, they're also products of that society. So this self-examination about ethics and racism and sexism was full of racist and sexist and anti-Semitic rhetoric. There's a philosopher named Otto Weininger who wrote a bestseller in which he talked about how homosexuality and Jewishness were both symptoms of what he called a feminized, aestheticized society. He said that the only cure was a masculine genius, and he called Richard Wagner the greatest man since Christ. In retrospect, the work is bigoted and pretty incoherent. And yet at the time it was hugely influential. And it makes you wonder how our moment in history right now is going to be viewed in the future, right? Weininger put forth the idea that anything that was purely aesthetical, purely beautiful, had no cultural value. Art needed more mojo than just being pretty. It had to have intentional cultural significance. Otto Weininger also shot and killed himself in the same house in which Beethoven had died. He was 23 years old, and it was intended as an artistic statement, and it did help him sell his book, but he wasn't around to profit from it, and he wasn't around to grow up enough to see that his ideas were racist and bigoted. I'm going to quote Alex Ross directly here. As in prior periods of cultural and social upheaval, revolutionary gestures betray a reactionary mindset. Many members of the modernist vanguard would tack away from a fashionable solidarity with social outcasts and towards various forms of ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and even Nazism. Moreover, only in a prosperous, liberal, art-infatuated society could such a determinedly antisocial class of artists survive or find an audience. The bourgeois worship of art had implanted in artists' minds an attitude of infallibility, according to which the imagination made its own laws, and that mentality made possible the extremes of modern art. So we have a mindset of reactionary art, and it sets up a context where the ugly in art is acceptable and it's actually ethically appropriate. So we often look at 20th century art and we say, it's kind of ugly. Is it art? Yeah, well, as art was defined, ugly was appropriate because what came before it was over-beautified. And so the artistic reaction to that is to use ugliness as an artistic statement. So that's where that starts coming from. But there's another reason that art was turning against the bourgeois tastes, and this might be more tangible and direct. The bourgeois taste, at this point, heavily favored the work of Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven. The same dead white men that we're still worshipping in concert halls across the planet today. Turn of the century Vienna was infatuated with old music, and before that, new music was always valued. Mozart was played during his life, but then less after his death. Bach's work was forgotten after he died until Mendelssohn rediscovered it. So the composers of the early 1900s suddenly were seeing the establishment of a canon. The audience was looking for older composers suddenly. They had an interest in these older composers. The establishment of a canon in this context means what is played. If you're in the canon, your work is played in concert halls. If you're out of the canon, your work was forgotten. The musicians of the early 1900s were seeing dead people's music dominating concert programs. Some numbers here. In the late 1700s, in the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, so we're looking at one orchestra as an example, but in the 1700s, 84% of the repertoire was by living composers. By 1855, that number had declined to 38%, and by 1870, it was down to 24%. Arnold Schoenberg, the man responsible for the development of 12-tone music, so kind of the uglification of 20th century music by some people's argument, he said, and this argument seems rational when you think about it, but his argument was that if bourgeois audiences were losing interest in new music, and if the emerging mass audience was losing interest in classical music in general, remember that with the advent of new technology, people were listening more to jazz because it sounded good on the records. They didn't know how to record classical music yet in terms of the technology. So popular music is growing in interest, classical music is reducing in interest, and of the remaining people, if the remaining audiences weren't going to pay attention to living composers' music anyway, well then, according to Schoenberg, the serious artist should stop flailing for a bid for attention, and instead should withdraw into what he called principled solitude. So to go just deeper into that difficult critical music. Mahler wrote of the idea of vox populi, the voice of the people, wondering if the voice of the people was a representation of the voice of God. Schoenberg was on the opposite side of that coin. He felt that the voice of the people was actually like the voice of the devils. He said, if it is art, it is not for all. And if it is for all, it is not art. Yikes. So he's saying art is just this tiny little thing, and the mass populace is just munching down on kitsch. Where does that put us? Certainly on a very rocky road. So where did this schism come from again? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. Did Schoenberg break off from public taste because he was angry? Were his views expressive of a greater societal disdain for the attitudes of the bourgeoisie? Or were his words truly a rational response to what might have been an irrational vitriol or distaste from the public? It's really hard to say, but Vienna around the 1900s shows us a fairly depressing view of artists and audiences kind of washing their hands of each other. These two groups that need each other, they are done. They go these separate ways, giving up on the dream of common ground. So this chapter we just finished, we were looking at the schism between artist and audience in Vienna, representing this Austro-German world. Next time we're going to look at the same topic, but in Paris. There's a slightly different story unfolding there. Till next time.